This is the France 24 debate. We're asking, is it too late for sanctions when it comes to a Russia which staunchly denies any hand in the shooting down of flight MH17, the U.S., which says it has new evidence that Russia is providing new anti-aircraft weapons to pro-Moscow separatists. With us to talk about it, is Tornike Gordadze, who teaches at the French Political Science Institute Sciences Po, Georgia's former European Affairs Minister. Also with us, Mathieu Bouleg, the Eurasia Project Manager at risk consultants AESMA, and Catherine Field is with us as well, journalist Catherine Field, and from Washington, James Kirchhoff, who is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Initiative. Over the past weeks, the scale of the fighting has grown more and more intense, and 3 weeks after Kiev took back the flashpoint city of Slavyansk that we mentioned just before the break, it's way too soon to talk about how Ukrainians themselves are divided, are going to bury the hatchet, not with the discovery of mass graves.
A somber Sunday Mass in the Protestant Church of Slavyansk. The congregation coming together to mourn 4 of their own found dead in a mass grave last week.
Oh God, it's so painful and it is so difficult.
Pastor Alexander is the father of 2 of the victims. Consoled by his own flock, he remembers what happened on June 8th as his sons left church.
I saw it with my own eyes. Several armed men came in cars and they said that my son's cars were under investigation. And without any explanation, they were taken away. And that was the last time I saw them alive.
What's left for Alexander are these family photos. Now any family portraits will be missing 2 members. Police received a tip-off that the bodies would be found in central Slavyansk, close to a children's hospital.
So here's the place where the mass grave was.
Investigators say the separatists buried the dead here during the siege, in part because they had no other choice, as government forces prevented any escape.
We found 14 bodies here. These people were killed for different reasons. During the investigation, the witness told us that there are several mass graves in the city where people who died during the occupation are buried.
11 of the bodies have not yet been identified. Local resident Valeri was here when the remains were exhumed.
I saw with my own eyes how the bodies were taken out. The bodies were put in the grave without coffins, without anything. They piled the bodies one on top of another. They were wrapped in white plastic bags.
The local police have registered 23 claims for missing persons. Another 11 people have officially disappeared. As the Ukrainian government reasserts its authority here in Slavyansk, the fear is now that more mass graves such as this one could yet be uncovered.
Again, that report there by Luke Brown. Mathieu Bouleg, we're in a situation where we're wondering now, with the ratcheting up of sanctions, the ante being raised on the world stage, we're forgetting perhaps that inside of Ukraine, how are you going to reunite people in Slavyansk? Because we saw in that report, there's no one specific reason why people were killed there, and we don't know by whom they were killed either. You were there for the presidential election. At this point in time, are we further away from reconciliation inside of Ukraine?
Well, how can you reconcile Slavyansk and the east and Crimea too? So how can you reconcile 1/3 of the territory? And even more, how can you reconcile a country where you have no prime minister at the moment, when Prime Minister Yatsenuk tendered his resignation, when no negotiations, genuine negotiations are going on in eastern Ukraine, and parties are pushing for even more anti-terrorist operations. So I don't really see the wound healing anytime soon.
Could President Poroshenko have played his hand differently?
Could he have played a hand altogether, I'd say, because he was elected because someone needed to be elected. And I don't see anything moving really fast in Ukraine at the moment. So I don't see any hand being played, if not waiting. And the more time we wait, the more Russia is winning the upper hand.
Tornike Gordadze.
Yeah, I agree on the fact that there should be a reconciliation and there should be a serious work of the Ukrainian government to find a solution, but after the military fight ends. This for sure, because the solution is not only military. This is the first stage, and then there should be negotiations, proposals, etc., with the people who live in Donetsk and Luhansk. But at the same time, we shouldn't depict the situation as a kind of civil war in Ukraine. You don't have civil war in Ukraine. You have a quite limited territories that are under the insurgents' control, supported by Russia, and all opinion polls, including serious Russian opinion polls, in this Donetsk and Luhansk regions show that only 20 to 25% of Lugansk and Donetsk region population supports the separation and the pro-Russian militias. You have exactly the same amount of people who support Ukrainian government. In the middle, you have 50 to 60% of the population who just want peace. So we shouldn't show on one side that the country is really 50-50 and there's a kind of, the civil war and these people cannot reconcile and live together. This is not the case yet, at least.
All right, and earlier we told you of the Dutch investigators forced to turn back. Making that announcement was Donetsk's new head of security, and this is something James Kirchik referred to in the first part of our discussion. His name is Vladimir Antuyefeyev, who used to bear the same job description in the Moldovan breakaway region of Transnistria. He's a 63-year-old native of Siberia who was active in Chechnya during the 90s, the latest Russian national to suddenly pop up in a position of power among the separatists. And that brings us to the topic of the sanctions. How do I put this? Catherine Field, when MH17 went down, the blame went straight to Moscow. When you see this kind of new leader for the movement, it looks like the hand of Moscow. But how much do you blame Moscow for the fact that there are separatists in eastern Ukraine?
Well, they're clearly, could we say, under the influence or directed by Moscow. They would not have the equipment, they would not have the guidance, they would not have the impulse to be doing what they're doing unless Moscow is saying, yes, keep doing this, keep doing this. It's true, in the last week we've seen more actual Russian troops coming over. We've seen more evidence of direct Russian involvement, whereas up until then everyone had been saying Russian influence, that sort of fudging it a bit. So, yeah.
You're getting the sense that there's direct involvement from Moscow that's on the increase. James Kirchik, do you agree?
Well, it seems that way. I mean, and you forgot to mention in this gentleman who was just dispatched to Ukraine, he was also involved in the Soviet coup against the independent Latvian government, I believe, in 1991 when they were trying to break away from the Soviet Union. He's sort of a freelance troublemaker throughout the former Soviet Union. The Russians really seem to be spitting in the West's face by increasing their involvement. And there doesn't even seem to be a pretense anymore that this is an independent separatist movement led by Ukrainian nationals. I mean, it's pretty much openly being led and directed by Russian citizens.
He's on a list of new individuals under sanctions, Tornike Gordadze.
These gentlemen? Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure, probably. But the fact I wanted to underline is that this is not something new. In Georgia, in the years of 2000, we had half of South Ossetian government were people who were coming directly from Moscow, from different Russian security services, and they were the ministers of the self-proclaimed South Ossetian government. This happened in 2004, 2005, 2006. So this is something that we missed in the West, and we didn't understand, and we didn't take lessons from this. So now we're again facing the same situation. These people, this is a new kind of warfare that Russia starts. It's 10 years ago in Georgia, now in Ukraine. Ukraine, 15 years ago in Georgia and in Moldova. So there's no clear frontier or limits between what is regular forces and proxies and some criminal elements, and everything can be mobilized. This is kind of new approach. This is not a direct confrontation of regular armies with another regular army, but people who are, officially they work for Russian security services, but then when they reappear in Ukraine and Georgia, they act as kind of free riders.
And we see the ante being upped now at the European level. Over the weekend, we had reports relayed most notably by the Daily Telegraph that Vladimir Putin has stopped taking Angela Merkel's phone calls.
I think Angela Merkel has realized that even if she does make the phone call, the person she's speaking to at the other end is just not listening. Yes, within the last couple of hours, you've had this conversation between Barack Obama, Angela Merkel, David Cameron in Great Britain, Hollande here in France, and of course the Italian Prime Minister, all coming out and saying these sanctions tomorrow have got to be passed, it's got to be tougher. Angela Merkel has said now she'll come back from holiday if need be to make sure these sanctions get tougher. So yeah, he's stopped taking her calls. She's realizing he's not going to move until it gets tougher sanctions.
All right, tougher sanctions, what kind of sanctions? And do you go for those so-called sectorial sanctions that affect things like energy and armament, where, as we may want to recall, the French are in the midst of selling two naval frigates, two warships, Mistral-class warships. What does it mean to get tougher on sanctions?
Well, to get tougher, you have to really get into the bone of Russia, which means sectorial sanctions targeting the oil and gas sector, which is also shooting yourself in the foot in terms of
and already the European Commission President, one of the European Commission leaders, Herman Van Rompuy, says he doesn't want it to hit the gas sector, only the oil sector.
Exactly, because it's less strategic than the gas sector, because we need Russian gas to make sure that we don't get too cold in the winter, especially for Eastern European countries. But it also shows, these sanctions also shows the different strategies from countries. You mentioned France, which has the Mistral contract, Germany, who wants to keep the relationship afloat with Russia, and the UK, who is pushing for a harder line. So how do you reconcile all these positions to create tough sanctions? It's the EU, so it's the smallest common denominator that ends up at the end of the day. And something small and common is not something tough.
So what do you expect?
Nothing.
Nothing at all?
I expect some sectorial sanctions on the oil sector, but when push comes to shove once again, and when we're going to start getting cold in the winter, we'll talk about it again.
James Kirchhoff, we had a mild winter over here. I don't know what it was like over in the United States. Do you see the point of Europeans who have to think twice on this?
I do on the gas and the energy issues, and I think it was wrong for the Germans to abandon nuclear power several years ago. I think that was an overreaction, and we're now seeing the costs of that. But I do think you can't allow Russia to have this sway over you. And at some point, you have to stand up for yourself and be independent. And certainly that extends to what France is doing with the Mistrals. I mean, with all due respect, I love France. I think it's a wonderful country, but this is absolutely shameful. And this should not be going through. You're selling weapons to a government that is waging war on a European country.
It's waging war on a European government, but Mathieu Bouleg, we're talking about a nation where we're hitting record unemployment. It's a 1.1 billion euro deal in an area that votes socialist, which is the party of the current president. What do you do if you're François Hollande?
Oh God, it's a good thing that I'm not in his shoes. The one thing is either you honor your contract, and either way Russia could steal your technology if you don't sign it, and you're good to get some compensations for not signing the contract. But as you said, we desperately need the money, so he has to come from where it is.
So what should he do?
I'm not a national leader, so it's good that I don't have to make a choice.
Oh, you're sitting the fence on this.
Well, can I add, there's a proposal that was raised by a congressman here, which is that the NATO countries should come together and buy the Mistrals, and they should be under the combined command of NATO. If the French are really going to make an issue out of the money, then that is one potential solution to this.
So that would mean getting into NATO's will. So that would either get into Russia's will or NATO's will. So it's
France is a NATO member.
Yeah.
So getting into NATO's will is not equivalent of getting in Russia's will. So there's a huge difference. First thing, and second, we're talking about also some credibility of France as an arms supplier on the world level, and I would say, what about our credibility as a country that has allies and listens to
now
its
says
allies.
it's willing.
It's my personal.
It now says it's willing to hit the pause button on the delivery of the second boat, which by the way I think is called the Sevastopol.
France should try to find a solution. It's a very big problem. It was you mentioned French socialist government, but this deal was made under the previous government, and it's not that like the left government decided to sell these boats to Russia. So it's something that engages, of course, France as a state, but at the same time, I think France should be more active in finding alternative solutions.
All right. Speaking of finding alternative solutions, the Russian president himself says he's ready to find alternative solutions. He spoke to his defense cabinet ahead of the prospect of sanctions on armament.
With all the difficulties we are facing, frankly speaking, I do not see many difficulties. Nevertheless, the difficulties that do exist must serve Russia, and we must develop our own production.
Catherine Field, does he have a script or is he improvising?
Well, one never knows with Vladimir Putin these days. So clearly, he's having to redo his speech every couple of days at the moment. But back to this point about the warships, the Mistrals, there is an option on the table there for France. It could take it. And it's not just the fact that this Mistral is a contract that's been agreed. We, the West, are giving Russia enormously advanced technology, not just on this warship. We are giving the Russians technology that's about 5 or 6 generations ahead of what they've got at the moment. So it's not just a ship. It's technology that they can rip off, they can copy, and that makes them jump so many leaps ahead of where they are at the moment. And for that, France should be looking at what it stands for, looking at what France as a nation stands for, and going to NATO and say, let's talk about this deal.
Which brings us back again to the question of what are you expecting from this week out of Brussels, out of Europe?
Oh, I'm expecting that they finally come to the table. I'm expecting to see sector sanctions coming in. We've been seeing this for ages and ages. They've been talking about, oh, should we go to stage 3? Should we go to stage 3? And I think when that Malaysian Airlines plane was down, that was a game changer. It really did mean that when you've got a plane goes down and 200 of the 300 people on board who die are EU nationals, then the EU has to say, okay, what are our values? What are our interests? This is what we stand for.
And that's what the German finance minister said in an interview with Bild am Sonntag, where he talked about at some point you have to put peace ahead of economic interests.
Indeed, and also Wolfgang Schäuble said the same. And I think what's interesting there are the nuances. They're talking about peace. They're not talking about conflict. So if you start talking about conflict, the Russians just, oh, that's why the West is always talking about conflict. So a bit more nuanced, giving Russia a bit of a way out, and also actually finally realizing that Germany does have a few cards up its sleeve, that it can take the hit for a short time.
Germany does have a few cards up its sleeve. Let me ask you, James Kirchhoff, on this point. We've heard all along, Angela Merkel, she speaks Russian. Vladimir Putin, he was based in Leipzig, he speaks German. That this was supposed to be the channel by which we could all de-escalate all of this. How do you see Germany's role going forward?
Well, I hope it gets better. It's been very problematic the past couple of months, and I think this has been partly a result, actually, of Edward Snowden and the Snowden disclosures about American espionage conducted in Germany, which drove up a spike in anti-American opinion. And so in the immediate aftermath of the Crimean occupation, you saw 49% of Germans supporting their country taking a middle ground position between Russia and the West, and only 45% supporting Germany being a part of a united Western front. So we've seen a very problematic role here of Germany. I fear a return of sort of German neutralism, Ostpolitik, from the Cold War era, which would be disastrous. So if there's any silver lining to be found in this tragedy, it would be that it finally wakes the German public up to realize who their real friends and allies are and who the real threat is.
Mathieu Bouleg?
If we need to start getting tough, it's not a common ground. We need to find its real manpower.
How so?
By Germany, for instance, taking the lead and showing that it will not cave in front of Russia's interests in Europe. It will not be bullied into non-cooperation with the EU to serve Russia's interests.
So what does that mean concretely? What should Germany do?
Take some kind of strong position and advocate for sanctions, for instance. That would show Russia, for a start, that Germany will not be a pawn in the equation. It will not convey Russia's message in the EU.
All right, but in the case...
If I could add one thing, you know,
yeah.
Poland and the Baltics have been asking for an increased presence of NATO troops in their countries, and it's been largely Germany and some degree France, which have been standing in the way of this. So I think the Germans should reconsider their position and stand by their Eastern and Central European allies.
So what we're prescribing here is an increase in troops, an increase in sanctions. How do you bring about a political solution in that respect, James Kirchhoff?
Well, I think you have to negotiate from a position of strength. And I think it's clear that America, Europe, the West, if you will, is stronger than Russia. And we have to stop being afraid of our own shadow here. I think if we, play the full deck of cards that we have, that we can come out winning, if you will, and really having the Russians back down. But for too long, we've been too afraid to use the power, economic, military, at our disposal.
Tornike Gordadze.
Yeah, if I may, just three quick points. First, we should avoid Europe and the US and inside Europe to be divided. This is the objective number one of Vladimir Putin from the very beginning, and with this airplane crash is becoming more difficult now to be divided. Second, the long-term solution is only political, and Ukrainian governments, with our help, should find people in Donetsk and Lugansk who are not linked directly to Russia. They can have also some legitimate claims and requests, and to find these people, it's not going to be easy, because all the system that was built by Yanukovych, that was the real Donetsk system, just crashed, and most of them fled to Russia or are now fighting together with the Russians. But it should be done. And maybe the last point is that we should also help our allies in the region, Eastern European countries, members of NATO, members of European Union, and those who also aspire to become members or to get just closer to help them to reinforce their sovereignty. That's all. That's the beginning of our answer. And at the end, of course, we should find also a common solution with Russia to help them to realize that they can live without Ukraine, and the West is not trying to dismantle or to destroy Russia. That's what Vladimir Putin claims all the time.
Not trying to dismantle Russia, but nonetheless joining NATO in Vladimir Putin's backyard. That's what people are espousing. The idea that right now in Moscow the perception is that it's winner takes all, and that Kiev is won and the Russian-speaking minority has lost inside of Ukraine, and that they need to do something to stand by them. What do you do in that situation to reassure Russia?
A Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine is much larger than the people who are fighting against Ukrainian government.
But how do you reassure Moscow? How do you reassure?
No, it's okay. We can try to do anything to reassure Moscow, but the problem is in Moscow, because they are afraid of having any kind of democratic or pro-Western government on their borders. It's not just joining NATO, because nobody is now currently speaking about Ukraine joining NATO tomorrow. All this problem started with the deal with European Union. It's not about NATO. All this problem started with the economic deal and political deal with the European Union. It was even not membership of European Union of the Ukraine. So this red line was was put, or the stakes were raised by Russia themselves. So, okay, we can all the time try to reassure them, but it's quite difficult to reassure them because, as I said, Vladimir Putin is not very rational when it comes this region and when it comes democracy or Western type of states emerging on its borders, because he feels that he will be the next.
And increased sanctions, or is that stepped up sanctions? Is that not going to reinforce that feeling?
Probably, yeah. He believes that the sanctions will reinforce his, patriotism and nationalism, and but it will stand for some time, but not for forever. He has probably this Iranian example when the regimes subsisted, but it will not stand forever. Russia is a different type of country.
All right. Before we go, just tell you we've had a lot of reactions from you. We'll just read just one here. We need to sanction the people who shot down the plane. Otherwise, it would be unfair to the victims' families. That from Amel. I want to thank Tornike Gordadze, Catherine Field. I want to thank Mathieu Bouleg and James Kirchhoff for joining us from Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.